we got a lot to get through. I wish we could meet a bit more properly in person, but so perhaps a little bit of context, because I do see a lot of names that I don't recognize. Myself and Lindsay Barberi, who's not here today, co-chair the drone cluster in ESIP. We started off in about 2015, purely on a basis of we needed somewhere to talk to other data experts and work out what we were going to do to handle data coming off Lindsay's drone. It was literally started out of needs must. And since then, this group has, sure, we've done a bunch of things, but broadly, the point of this cluster is to look at how to handle data coming off drones. And we wrote a paper a year and a half ago now. Would love to talk more if anybody wants to talk more about why data coming off drones isn't just a cut and paste, reuse remote sensing techniques or reuse existing data management workflows. The short answer is because the temporal and spatial space that drone data exists in is different. And then add to that just the fact that the pipeline from sensor onboard drone to archive is different. Add to that the data technology space is changing for the better, as well as the funding space. And then finally, probably a huge driver is that all of us are starting to use drones compared to, I don't know, a decade ago, that would have been the purvey of primarily NASA and the large scale organizations that have a couple $1 million. And now those of us that don't have a couple $1 million can still afford to buy a drone and do some real relevant science. And we want to share that data. So that's the space that the drone cluster exists in. I'm hoping to use the last 10 minutes or so of this session to talk about some practical next steps for this cluster, because I think last meeting we'd published the paper, and so a lot of this session is going to be about a project I lead with Chuck Vardaman, who is also on this call from the University of Notre Dame, where I used to be. I've recently just moved universities to the University of Cape Town. And we have a project funded by Sloan to build tooling to help with this problem of complex data pipeline from sensor onboard drone to nowadays we want that data to be published fair. And we are not claiming that we are going to solve that entire pipeline, but we're certainly making some good steps towards that. So I'll leave that as the introduction. I don't know what works best in these large Zoom sessions, but I would say if you have questions, stick a hand up, and whoever's speaking, we'll try and get to it. I'll certainly make a note of who's raising their hands as others are speaking. Brief overview, Chuck's going to speak now about extensive work we've been doing on trying to build some ontologies and ontology infrastructure to support our end goal of fair drone data. A bunch of the people who've been working with us on different components of the tool stack are going to speak. I'm going to give a brief demo of one of the components that we're building under this project, which is towards onboard real-time annotation of the data. And then, like I said, I'd really like us to wrap up with what else does the ESIP drone cluster want to move into? There's some interesting work happening in the broader global community space as drone use has matured in particularly environmental science. So that's where we're going. Now I need to work out how to turn over to Chuck. I assume you can share your screen, Chuck.
Chuck should be able to share it without changing any permissions. So Chuck, Give it a whirl.
Hopefully everyone can see my intro slide.
You bet.
Okay, everything else disappeared for me. Yeah, okay, as long as everyone can see the intro slide, Zoom hit itself very nicely here. So, oh, there we go. it popped back up. Okay, so without further ado, because this is sort of as every session I guess I've been in has been relatively, oops, what's going on here? Relatively compact. Jane just introduced LANDRS. For those of you that don't know FAIR, this is a brief schematic of it. It basically stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it's basically a goal of what your scientific data should aim toward, right? So those are the FAIR data principles. And so in LANDRS, we're trying to basically enable these things, not just for humans, but for machines, right? And so doing that via machine means defining structured data, which there have been some really good sessions earlier today on that. And then defining meaning, which is basically semantics. And we do that through ontologies. And so one of the goals of this project is not to create an entirely new standard, but to rather leverage those. And so you obviously, this is a well-worn comic from XKCD on standards proliferation. And so what we want is 14 and a half standards, not a 15 standard. And the 14th and a half standard we want to connect to other standards, right? And so linked data principles essentially allow us to do that. And so how are we doing that? Well, there's a really good article that I'm putting in here just for reference, but the important slide is sort of this one, right? And so when we're doing ontology design, we can basically do these sort of multi-level layer extractions, right? And so there's a really good set of upper ontologies that people have been working on for 30 and 40 years. There's a bunch of mid-level ontologies that use those, right? And as it turns out, if you look at what's being used on the web, it's mostly these mid-level ontologies. Those are the things that are connecting things to one another. And so there's SOSA SSN, which is a sensor ontology, which is an OGC and W3C standard. There's PROV, which is a W3C standard, which is being adopted by the scientific community because it tracks provenance. FOAF is a early one, right? And then there's domain ontologies underneath that, and those are sort of things like the gene ontology and the chemical ontology of entities of biological interest, and these sort of VSSO, which is a sensor ontology, which we actually leverage, right? And so there's sort of that layer underneath, and then there's use case ontologies, which is basically what we're developing, right? And so we have LANDRS, which is an application level sort of thing, and we basically want to tie things together through this ontology design stack. And so the other issue that we run into is that there's different levels of formality, right? And so there's something called schema.org, which people are using for the findability, this discoverability piece. But there's also large data sources that exist out there in Wikidata and DBpedia. And so people are also trying to connect to those. And those also come back to this linked data cloud, is that we want to give context to agents in multiple ways. We want to link to other things so that agents can figure out, is this the same thing that I'm looking for? Is this something different? What's the actual underlying context? And so one way of doing that, and this is what we're sort of doing in LANDRS right now, is we're developing a simpler schema, which we call schema.landrs.org, which is sort of at a schema.org level, right? And that's exactly what the sensor ontology that the W3C developed does. So SOSA basically has a module, which is a vocabulary at a schema.org sort of formalism. And then they have something that's a lot more formal called the Semantic Sensor Network Ontology, or SSN. And that imports SOSA, but then it extends it, right? It adds a lot more structure and meaning to the underlying ontology. So agents can, if they can utilize, this structure and formality, they can gain a lot more from the data. But you're not required to use that. You can still make a lot of headway in just using the SOSA. And so that's very much the same thing that we're doing in LANDRS, right? So we have these modules, this modular idea. Okay. The other thing that we're trying to do is, as I said, we're trying to link to other things. So we're using this sort of this 5 stars idea of linked data, but also 5 stars of linked vocabularies. And here that means that we're explicitly linking to other vocabularies in our vocabulary, like SOSA, like PROV, like DCAT, and schema.org to explain to agents what it is that we're talking about. And we're also providing metadata about our various modules so that agents themselves can figure out, what this vocabulary is in terms of a thing in the world in and of itself, right? And so the other interesting paper that was just sort of published in Archive is sort of this fair implementation of vocabularies and ontologies. And we've been actually following many of these guidelines and recommendations, but I recommend that people have a look at it because it's a very readable resource about how to actually go about building something that is a vocabulary that's fair in and of itself, right? Because it's a thing that in the world that should be fair, right? So things that we're leveraging, I mentioned earlier, so the semantic sensor network ontology, this is one of the core, sort of modules or components that we link to. DCAT, because drones produce data sets and we want to expose the data sets through APIs. DCAT lets us do that. Prov, because we have extensive provenance of who's capturing the data, how it's being captured, what procedures, what rules, what data is derived from other data. So Prov gives us that. Owl time. So these are spatial temporal sorts of operations that we're creating. And so we're using this W3C just new sort of note, technical report note on temporal aggregates and how to use owl time in terms of building out things that are temporally related. And then we're leveraging science on schema.org, which is an ESIP cluster project here for the schema.org level sort of module that I mentioned earlier, right? In terms of talking about data sets, annotating landing pages, how do we get information out to crawlers so that data sets are discoverable? And then one last one I'll mention that is a relatively new one. And this is called Dingo, but it's basically a collaboration between schema.org and Wikidata and Dublin Core. And I think that it'll probably end up in all of these sorts of places. And it basically captures information about grants and projects and roles in projects and research. And so it sort of builds out this attribution cloud so you can track data from something, an instrument or something that may have collected the data to a particular project that was associated with to a funder, right? And so that way you can more, better able to track sort of attribution and reward attribution, right? And we're also linking to likewise projects, right? So there's this Turn Ontology, which is the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network in Australia. They're building out something that looks very similar, right, in terms of leveraging SOSA and schema.org. And so by the fact that we're using these mid-level ontologies, so to speak, we can then essentially create things that are marked up similarly so that if somebody's looking for something in Turn and looking for something that is leveraging a LANDRS resource, they can use them together, right? And so this is this crosswalking for context sort of thing. So this is what some of our ontology patterns or ontology alignment activities sort of look like. They're these sort of graphs, right, which then connect to everything in blue is us, and then we connect to other things like DCAT in green and yellow, Prov in yellow, and SSN here and system in yellow, right? And so there are these basically graph fragments that we start to build out that then create the core of what we're trying to do. We also are linking to this minimum information model, right? So we're doing alignments to that allow people that if they just want to give a little bit of information, which we think is sort of the core information that should be associated with drone data, there's a crosswalk to get you to these more formal descriptions, right? So if someone is searching for information using the more formal description, they can still get to a more simple description that somebody has approached. We use a design pattern based approach. So this is a EarthCube funded project that was looking at ocean cruise data. And you'll notice that there's some similarity, right, in terms of event, right, which we're leveraging. And this idea that there's a cruise, in our case, it's a flight, right? And a flight has roles like pilot and these sorts of things. And so when we're designing out these alignments to these other sorts of ontologies, we're also building out extensions to them in our own namespace that gives more precise information. And we're using patterns to do that, right? And so, I put this slide up that, this is what I hear a lot, that this is great and it seems really cool and everything else. But, you know, how do we start to build applications? Because if we are just building knowledge graphs without applications, then it becomes very hard for end users to see what's going on. And so later on, assuming I get done talking here shortly, we'll see demonstrations of how web developers and machine learning experts and other sorts of folks can leverage this information, learn how the semantic web sort of mechanisms work, and then extend it for their own sorts of things, right? And so one of the key ways that we're doing that is by using shapes. And so Shackle is a shape constraint language. That's a W3C recommendation or standard in that, in other terms. And it basically lets us constrain what we mean in terms of the knowledge graph, what things are required, what things aren't required, right? And so you can do really interesting things with this, because now you can create an application-centric sort of view of the knowledge graph and define what the application is concerned with, right? And so that then lets a web developer say, okay, I only need to build a web form that populates this sort of information. And we can automatically build web forms by essentially doing this sort of mapping between Shackle and you know, web development toolkits, say like Vue.js or React or these other sorts of things. And so what we want to be explicit about is that there's different layers of semantics that are going on. And so we want to be explicit to an agent that is talking to another, you know, agent trying to find information, that there's things that are semantics that are associated with our application, which is akin to a view, but that there's broader semantics, and that if it follows its nose, it can get more information from these top level, mid and top level ontologies, right? Okay. So this is an example of reuse. So the other thing that we want to be able to do is reuse the semantic layer to do web development, right? And so we want to be able to generate views literally in web applications, generate forms. And we also want to be able to do embedded markup, right? Use basically create templates that through a Sparkle query can create the metadata that is crawled by schema.org, or excuse me, crawled by Google using schema.org markup, right? And so this lets us essentially reuse the underlying semantic stack. And so the other thing that I'm sort of interested in is how do we start doing continuous integration in development? And one of the little toy projects that I've started and we're now integrating into the main LANDRS development is how do we use Shackle and GitHub workflows to essentially build out a application, so to speak, using test-driven development, just like we would for a web application. And so there's this thing called Sharness, which is follows the test anything protocol, and it's actually was extracted from the Git tool itself. So Git basically uses Sharness to test its own command line tool functionality, right? And it's basically just the shell script. And if you combine that with something called PyShackle, which is a RDF lib project that basically does validation against the graph, you can actually build testing tools, right? And so, for instance, let's say that I wanted to find a rule in Shackle that basically says that every ontology that I build should have a title, right? So there should be a human readable title so that I can create documentation. And so this basically this little set of turtle here basically this little shell script defines a bunch of test cases for that I can then build out instances that satisfy the tests and the tests themselves, right? And so I can create a shape that basically says that I want to specify a title in these using these vocabularies, right? And then I can write a set of turtle that passes, and then I can run it, right? And so now I end up with something that I can automate in GitHub workflows, and I can tell if something is broken along my chain, right? And so this is a very simple example of how you could, you know, build out something that's more complicated using these modular blocks, right? The other thing that I'm interested in is how can we start to bridge the gap between this sort of API-centric view and this sort of linked data semantic webby sort of view, right? And one way that we can do that is by building sort of these Sparkle microservices. And so you'll see an example of that in what Jane is working on, right? And so these are little micro endpoints that are containerized that then are talked to a web server. We use traffic actually as our URI rewriting tool. And so a link data client can talk to that. Sparkle then points to a web API. And so you can basically keep track of the semantics of what the API endpoints are through the Sparkle microservice, right? And this also gives us the ability to then store things that are outside of what should be stored in an RDF graph, right? And so a set of images should not be stored in an RDF graph, but the resource about those images should be, right? And so this gives us the ability then to point to other resources. We then use actually Sparkle in our web development. So we do Sparkle queries that then, just like you would do a GraphQL or some other sets of technologies or a REST or Open API to figure out what the actual structure of the API is, right? And so then an agent can figure out, is this something that I can talk to? Do I know how to talk to this? And what can I get at each of the resources, right? And so we basically use APIs to wrap Sparkle, right? And so for updates and things like that, we don't let you talk directly to a Sparkle endpoint, which is a graph query language. We basically let you do a post to a endpoint, which then talks to it, right? And so we have this way of then providing sort of the horsepower, if you really want, to do advanced sorts of queries using Sparkle, but also then provide the ability, if you want to do very simple things, of just writing a JSON string to an endpoint, of being able to do that, and stuff automagically gets updated in the graph, right? We are using this idea of a web API semantics so that so APIs have semantics in and of themselves. There is a DCAT community group report that basically lets you specify how you're documenting your API. And so you can document an API using something called Hydra Core Vocabulary or Open API or one of the OGC specifications, say for a OGC WFS service. And so this basically lets us expose in our metadata and in the graph what the actual semantics of the endpoint are, right, and how to talk to it, right? And so this is just a little quick snippet that people can go look at on their own about how we would describe an endpoint and content negotiation using that in the actual Sparkle queries. And so with that, I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome, and I will turn this back over for some demonstrations of the little bits and pieces that I was alluding to in my talk.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. So before we get to demo, Priscilla?
Hello. Okay.
Hello. Priscilla, introduce yourself, and then I hope.
Okay.
Can you share your screen? Does it give you permission to do that? Should do.
Okay. I'm Priscilla. I work at CRC. At the moment, I'm in an internship. I'm a computer scientist, and I have worked with LANDRS project 3 or 4 months, right? So I will present my experience and work in that area of linked data and the LANDRS project. And I'm a person from machine learning area, and I had experience with linked data before that and with the LANDRS project. So I will share with you what I learned and how I learned it. I hope it's useful. So let's share my screen. Okay. Sorry. Let's see here. Okay, I think I got it.
Looks good.
Okay. Sorry, it's not that. So I will share my experience with you about how I got from nothing to something on liquid data in LANDRS project. So at first, I worked with the user stories that the team already had, and I started to understand the project. And I built a UML class diagram to represent the concepts and relations. And at the same time, I had to understand the basic blocks for linked data, the principles and technologies. So to do that, my mainly source were hackathons with Charles, and I also took a course from the Open HPI by the Professor Sack. It's available online, so it's great also. Basically, I took my main source from that, and then, okay, I realized, okay, linked data are strongly related to the Semantic Web Technology stack. Okay, so my ask was, okay, which block I need to keep learning since I'm not from this area. So I started to study the block that is the information extends. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me present this figure. So here's the linked data technology stack, and here's the semantic technology stack. So there are relations between them, and I start to study the RDF part. So I took the I'm sorry. I took the RDF concepts and understand how it is, what it is, and different types of sterilizations. And then I started to understand the RDFS, that is a schema language to build knowledge representation data model, so we can create classes, properties, restrictions, and then have a logical inference. Okay, but for building ontology, I needed the OL, that is a web ontology language, to define models more in a way more elaborated, more complex, more expressive logical constraints to have that. So I needed to study that also. And then I went to study the SparkL. That's very important to conquer, to have the linked data concrete, right? So once we have the acknowledgement described with ontologies and RDF and so on, we need to make queries. We need to find the data, and SparkL give us this ability. So I went to that to study, and yeah. So after that, I also studied some vocabs, and that Charlie was mentioned before in his presentation, in order to have all the things making sense. Sorry. So here's like a way that I worked in this process. Okay, so from the user stories, from the DroneDataBuddy, I created this UML class diagram, and And Charles and I, we had some hackathons to start to build the ontology. And in this process, we used the Graceful, that's a web application tool, to create graphs and help us to build the ontology. So in this process, I learned how to, which vocabs were interesting in the process to build our ontology, that are vocabs that are in the middle level ontology, like Charles told in the pile of ontology. Okay, so in this moment here, we were trying to combine the middle ontology level to the level of use ontology. So after that, I built some turtle files. Actually, this app, the Graceful, it has a way to export turtle files. So we can even have this part of this process like automatically. So we can have this part of these turtle files, but we need to do some work on it yet. So here, okay, the turtle, it's a way to serialize the RGEP, okay? So we are using this in this part. And then we build our terminological acknowledgement box and our assertional acknowledgement box. And then we, once we have that, we define the, we start to use shackle to limit the domain. So we can put some restrictions we call shapes here for the ontology. And these files, these shackle shapes files, they can be used for the team, the web development team, to build, for example, Vue.js forms, integrate the ontology with the web application. So all that took Charles show before, I was learning during this process. We were building this kind of line, and I was learning how to connect the concepts to the concepts to the real life. So it was very interesting for me. So as a result, we built this. This is a part of our ontology. It's focused on the data source part. So how we are organizing the data acquisition. That's the mission are supposed to do, and we have the observation collection that is already. We have a hierarchy here with this SSNX, the PySOSA extension for observation collection. So we are using some properties from this concept here. So we have our own observation collection that will be a DCAT database. So we'll be able to make distribution of this data based on that pattern. Okay. So we can see the other alignments here. So flights, in our case, will be an event that will be a schema an event also, and a probe activity. Okay. Okay. Here more detail about the other part of the ontology that is concerned to the data capture plan. And we are using Prov a lot in this part. So we have a bunch of activities, associations, roles, and plans connected to our okay. So yeah, here are the reference that I mentioned before, the Liquid Data Semantic Web course. I also used 2 books. Here the name of the books, Validation RDF Data. It was very, very useful for me, and to understand how to use Chaco and RDF, and the ontology to understand how to build what's the way to build ontologies. And of course, the other main source I had was Chuck hackathons. Oh, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Priscilla.
No.
So I hope this is. I'm an electrical engineer. I came at this from I want to write I2C interfaces to capture data out of small sensors. Chuck is obviously an ontologist. Priscilla's just presented, and she's coming from the machine learning world. Next, we'll have some more computer programmers. So I don't know where people in the audience are with whether you're building drones or building sensors or you're environmental science expert or you're a data manager, but hopefully through these presentations you'll pick up pieces where you perhaps aren't familiar with the semantic tech stack or why necessarily we might be doing this. So next up is Badisa and Wame, who have been working on a Python module for building RDF graphs for us. Yeah, I will let them explain what they're doing. Badisa, can you share your screen, I hope? Or Wame, I don't know who has the presentation.
Hi, Jane, can you hear me?
Yes, that's great.
All right, let me share my screen right away.
And introduce yourself as well. Great.
Yep.
Can see it.
All right, is my screen visible?
Yes, thanks.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Badisa Mosesane. I'm from the University of Botswana Computer Science, and I'm part of the team that's developing the LANDRS project, specifically PySOSA module. And I'm not alone. I'm with Wame Rasionale, who will present at a later stage. So I'm going to give it a brief update on the linked and network drones project, specifically the PySOSA module that we have been developing as one of the ontologies for the LANDRS project. Now, PySOSA is basically a Python module for building SOSA-based RDF graphs. So if you may not be well conversant with SOSA and RDF graphs, so SOSA is a sensor, observation, sample, and actuator ontology that provides a formal but lightweight general purpose specification. And that helps with modeling the interaction between entities involved in the acts of observation, actuation, and sampling. And RDF basically is the resource description framework. You can think of it as a framework for representing information in the web, or a standard model for data interchange in the web. And the beauty of RDF is that it extends the linking structure of the web to use URIs to name the relationship between things as well as the two ends of the link. So this uses the notion of triples, where you have a subject, a predicate, and an object. So using RDF model allows us to structure, to have both structured and semi-structured data to be mixed, exposed, and shared across different applications. So that's basically PySOSA. It's a Python module that allows you to build SOSA-based RDF graphs. And to go into why PySOSA? So think of PySOSA as a fusion of the SOSA ontology and the Python programming language. So we use Python because Python is a commonly used in drone applications. You'd agree with me that Python, well, for us, it was within our skill range. So it was a perfect choice for us to build the SOSA module and the Python version. And the reason why we use SOSA is because SOSA is the most appropriate ontology that is available for the LANDRS use case. And it is backed by the Open Geospatial Consortium and World Wide Web, W3. So in terms of the developing PySOSA module, so we have this UML that was guiding us to develop this PySOSA. And one thing that I want to highlight in this UML is that PySOSA aims to comply with the structure of SOSA, and so as to provide the value to the community beyond LANDRS. So we are not entirely creating a new ontology altogether, but we are trying to make sure that PySOSA comply with the structure of SOSA, the already existing ontologies. And because LANDRS seeks to align with existing ontologies, PySOSA will be used in conjunction with the other ontologies that will be created in the LANDRS project. So just to show you the UML for PySOSA, we have modeled these entities as objects. So some of the classes that we have on PySOSA include the platform class, includes actuator, we've got classes like sampler and sensors. And each class will have attributes and some of the methods that you can invoke. For example, you can have class platform and class sensor, and these classes are joined together through a relationship. So you can have a platform that has got sensors, and then you can have a sensor that is attached to a particular platform. And then some of the methods that you can invoke on a platform class will be to set the platform ID, to add a sampler, you can add an actuator to the platform. So this is roughly how we modeled PySOSA, looking very closely to SOSA concepts. And then in terms of the use cases for PySOSA, PySOSA can be used to annotate multiple sensor streams on a drone for real-time analysis, and that can allow you to find some of the factors that affect the flight path. So basically, one of the use cases will be to allow end users to annotate multiple sensor streams on a drone for real-time analysis. To give an example, for instance, you may be flying your drone and you want to capture CO2 and air temperature simultaneously to detect point sources. And the point of air temperature capture is it will be used to correct CO2 sensor reading. So when you capture this, when you detect the point sources, that gives you the leverage to sort of improve the accuracy of your sensor readings. So another use case for PySOSA is automated metadata capture from the complex data pipelines that we already know and that are prone to human error. So PySOSA has this use case of automating metadata capture. So you can think of this as using PySOSA to run your drone somewhere, and then at the end of that flight, you have metadata attached to all the data that all the sensors were collecting. So how to use PySOSA? We are constantly developing the documentation for PySOSA, so we'll share those details later on. So you can basically do a pip install PySOSA from PyPy. It's still a pre-release at the moment. So if you do pip install PySOSA, you'll get that. And then you can clone the PySOSA repo and have a look at what has been developed. And issues and pull requests are welcome. So sample use cases for PySOSA, you can create RDF graphs on board sensor platforms. So you can create RDF graphs on board sensor platforms, for example, in drones for real-time or edge or local data analysis. And another use case to buttress it is to annotate sensor data at point of capture. So you don't need to go and collect data, bring the drone back, and then start doing the data annotation. But you can actually do it on the fly. So those are some of the use cases that you can have using this PySOSA module. So I'll hand off to Wame to take over to talk about the PySOSA documentation and some of the future work that we envisage. Thank you.
Wame, are you there?
It looks like she's having a problem connecting. Let me just continue the presentation.
Sure.
If that's fine, Jay.
Yeah. Just wrap it up. Thanks.
All right.
Sorry, Wame.
All right. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I was still talking about Python use cases. So you can annotate the sensor data at point of capture for improved data provenance and for also easier workflow. And one of the other things that we are looking into is to really have the use case to make the data that we are collecting from these platforms to be findable, to be accessible, to be interoperable, as well as reusable. Now, I was just talking about the PySOSA documentation. It's at the moment under pre-release, and you can do a pip install PySOSA, and then you can have access to some of the functions that we have developed. Most of the information on how you can use this PySOSA will be availed, or if you can go to our GitHub, you'll find all that information. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the experience when we were developing PySOSA. So first of all, we are not very experienced developers. So this was a very exciting development experience for us, coming from a zero knowledge of ontologies. So we spent a lot of time understanding the SOSA ontology as a whole. What are some of the concepts that SOSA embraces that we can then make sure that we factor into PySOSA? And then we spent lots of meetings with Jane and revisiting SOSA documentation to really understand what SOSA is and how PySOSA can sort of meet some of the challenges that are inherent in SOSA. And then we also looked extensively into how can we do tests on PySOSA, such that at the end of the day, the functions that we have and sort of use cases that we have can emulate some of the potential use cases that end users can use. And we're also looking into how we can integrate PySOSA into other Python modules that can be used for making scientific data fair coming from drones. And then we also had some nice experience writing useful documentation. Oftentimes we are excited about writing good code, but when you put yourself in a situation of who is the end user, are they going to be in a position to follow the documentation that we have written and be able to have PySOSA working? So these are some of the things that we are looking into as we were developing PySOSA. And we're about to release version 0.0.1. Keep on the lookout. So now, in terms of the future work, these are some of the additional development work that we think will be useful. So we want to implement a simple example for new users to say, if you're a new drone user and you want to use PySOSA, so let's say, for example, you're flying a drone over a water level, a dam, and you want to see water levels in that dam. So we want to implement a simple example for those kind of users. And we want to use PySOSA in conjunction with new modules that are being developed under the LANDRS ontologies, as well as in LANDRS tools. So that's all that I wanted to share with you for now. So I'll also just want to invite you to do pull requests on our GitHub link, which is github.com/LANDRS/PySOSA. Thank you.
Thanks, Vidisa. Great. So last developer perspective on this. Bastian is going to talk about from the point of view of developing web forms. And so for some context, in order to exploit all the ontologies and to do all this real-time annotation, real-time publication of your data, you need to first enter the information about your drone, about your sensors, about your system, about your project, obviously at some point once, at least, preferably only once. And so the simplest way to do that is via some sort of web form interface. However, that web form interface needs to be carefully curated. And so to speak to that development is here's Sebastian.
Hello. I'm in the same room as Jane, so it makes it quite easy. I am a web developer, or more specifically a research programmer at the University of Notre Dame. I've been there for about 3 years. And I'm going to be talking about the web app that Jane just mentioned. And so that's entirely sort of dynamically generated using the Shackle language, essentially. Yeah, and our experiences with doing that. I'm very new to the linked data world and ontologies in general, so this was quite a learning experience for me, building this app. But it was great, and I think there's a lot of things to glean from using the data in this way. Yeah, and so essentially, Jane mentioned this before, we wanted to automate the generation of the data input from validation rules. It's important to make sure the data is clean as it's going in, and to know what exactly is wrong with the data when it is uploaded, if there is an error, and those errors can be useful so that the user can make corrections to the input, essentially. And then the data will be captured in the best format possible that makes it easy to process later, or so and so forth. We use the shapes constraint language, or Shackle for short, which is a W3C spec for defining a collection of constraints in a single file or across multiple files, and so forth. It's written in Turtle or in JSON LD. And it can express a whole bunch of different conditions, including numbers of properties. So you can have somebody with multiple first names or multiple last names and so forth. The type of the value, like a number or a string, you can specify whether a number is greater or smaller than a particular range. It can do regular expressions, so you can match a specific pattern. And to even make it more complex, you can combine all of these things using some logic, which makes it even more powerful and at the same time a little bit more complex. So there's benefits and some downsides to that. This is an example shapefile that describes a person, very, very simple and rudimentary. Here, this person type is the expected input type, and they have 2 properties associated with them. So they have a social security number, which is essentially just a collection of characters. In this case, numbers separated by 2 dashes. So it's so this pattern, if you can see my mouse pointer over here, describes that it's 3 digits with a dash, 2 digits, a dash, and then 4 digits. And then the second property is an identifier, which is described by this line over here, which just says the company that this person works for. So there's not a lot of information associated with the person type, but I just wanted to keep it simple for this example. And then this last line means that you can't have additional properties, like this is a closed type, essentially. So a person will have only a social security number as well as the company that they work for. So it's a very trivial example, but it shows you exactly what you what you want to constrain the data to be. Okay, so let me talk about the actual portal now that we've built. So when you first log in, so just keep in mind that none of the things you see now are hard coded. Everything is generated from the constraints that have been defined before. So we took a file that looks similar to this, and then the output is what you see on the screen now. So in this case, we query the Sparkle server to see what the types are available, what types have been defined. In this case, for collecting the drone data, we have the flight controller board type as well as the sensor type. So a flight controller board can have a collection of sensors attached to it. In this case, but they just both listed here in this case. I just want to show you the relationship. Okay, so if we click on the Add New button, in this case, for the flight controller board, we're taken to a second interface where you can see a form. And again, what's happening in the background is that we read the shapefile for the flight controller board, and we go through the list of properties like we had for the person example before. And in this case, we have a whole bunch of 6 properties. 4 of them are required properties. So the top 3 properties have to be there and require only 1 value, whereas the 4th property, the hosts, can have at least 1 value. So if you click this blue plus button, you can have actually multiple, you can have a list or an array of values associated with that particular property. And that's all defined in the constraints file as well. And there's some data validation, like the manufacturer has to be a URL, whereas all the other data is a string. You'll notice here this as well, the host property is a drop-down. So this is the subtype I talked about. So you can have different sensors attached to the flight controller board. And so it goes and reads all the subtypes and finds the shape files for those, and then loads it in if there are instances of those in the system already. And you can select from those. Yes, and this is just the example of showing the sensor type as well. I think I'm missing a slide, but so if any of these, if you want to click the Add Flight Controller Board, there should be a validation message, error message if this any of these are invalid, and that can be a logical error, like if a number is less than a certain range, it'll give you a logical error, whereas it can also validate that it's a URL, like in the manufacturer case. Okay, and then I'm going to briefly talk about the tool stack that we use. So I primarily wrote that in JavaScript, so using Vue.js, and then the CSS was just Bootstrap. That's very typical of a web app these days. So you can use anything like Angular or whatever web framework you're familiar with. But then for the RDF data graphs, there's a number of libraries that I wasn't familiar with, and I had to use to ingest some of the graph data. So RDF ext, so that was the low-level one for actually loading the graphs into memory and then manipulating them. Then there's a very weird format called library called plant face, and this is it was very intuitive to me as a developer, and like it's a tiny library that had a very like a small subset of operations that made it simple to chain together to query the data in a very intuitive format, and so that was quite a useful little tool. It wasn't very mature, but there were a couple of bugs I found, but it's a really nice way of traversing this non-intuitive data, and I think it can go lots of places. It's great. Shackle.js, so this is where we loaded the shape files and then performed. So once we built up a instance graph, we would submit it to the Shackle.js engine, and then this would perform the validation and then output the report. So if the data conforms to the particular shackle or the shape file, the instance would be added to the Sparkle store. If it was not, if it did not conform to the shape file, it would produce a report attached to a particular field or property in the form and give you a relevant error message. So this library did the most heavy lifting, I would say, and that's the most important part. Then we also had the HTTP client, which actually did the Sparkle queries. So fetching the shape files and then posting the data to the store. Yeah, then in conclusion, I suppose, yeah, as a web developer, it was a very steep learning curve. If you're not, usually I just work with JSON. And so learning some of these tools took a while, but it became intuitive eventually. Some of the tools are still very new. They are usable. They have a lot of bugs, but I think as people get more familiar with the technology, it will become yeah, more stable and even easier to use. And it showed great potential to do further cool things and to be able to manipulate linked data. I think is pretty useful. That is it from me. Are there any questions?
I don't know how questions work in this format. Pretty bored. Thanks. So there are many moving parts behind all of this. Maybe I'll start with the end goal. So if linked data is a completely foreign concept to you, this is an example of where we're trying to get. This is a public data set that's been put online by, I have no idea who, that you can run queries on. And so this is just a generic query, but you could put in, turn this into drone questions. I'm looking for CO2 values over this portion of Australia over this time frame. And this is a Sparkle endpoint that you could run such a query on, and it would come back with some sort of response if such a data set was available. This is a GUI, this is a visible interface to this, but these same things can be run via machine interface. And so think Google or any of the search engines, they are doing this all the time, running it. So this was a query that was run on this public data set. I just clicked on this and it came up with this interface, and it seems to be a bird sighting. It's information about the data. And here's information about it. There's definitions. Because they've used an ontology to define what is here, I can go and find out what this is about, and hypothetically I can go and access the actual data. So that's the endpoint. The point of doing all the modeling that Priscilla's done, or the developing PySOSA, developing these auto-generated web forms, is that it would become trivial for Fred, the climate scientist, to go and fly his drone, once off, fill in those web forms that have been auto-generated, customized for his particular project, with all his information about NSF funding it. This is the goal. This is the region of interest. Fly. I'm going to show a little bit about what's happening on board the drone. At the end of the day, you walk back into your lab and it auto syncs. And if you so wish, that data can be readily available to public at basically no effort on your part. Click go. this is a recent paper that is actually the link to this public bird dataset, just showing that this same interface, they didn't have any 3D data. This is obviously just 2D, but the same interface can generate 3D data. So you can quickly see how that would be of relevance to drone data. If I could run a query saying, show me all the temperatures over 14 degrees Celsius in this geospatial region in this time period, at what altitude, something similar. So to do that, as you've seen, requires a lot of components, moving parts. This being 2020, everything is a bit strange. We had fully intended on having in-person demos with a drone and an onboard companion computer, probably a Pi. Can't do that, so I have made containers that are simulating. So if any of you are drone pilots that happen to use Autopilot or PX4, you'll be familiar with the CIDL simulator. It's just a drone simulator for these open source autopilots. I'm just running it here. That's all that I've done is I've turned it on. You'll probably also be familiar with, well, there are a couple different flight planning platforms. This is one of them. I'm going to connect to that container. Try and connect again. There we go. That seemed to work. So I'm connected. I've just made a very simple flight plan. I would upload it to a drone. This is exactly the process you would go through if you were flying a real drone. This just happens to be talking to a simulated drone in the background. Upload. And in theory, I could take off and fly this. So I don't know if you can see, but I'm starting to climb in altitude here. I'm not going to sit and watch it, but you can see it's easy to generate data. This is what a real drone would be doing. And now I'm going to disconnect it and show you that drone would, in the real world, have been producing a stream of telemetry. That's a convenient stream for me right now, just as everything's simulated, but that could equally have been a stream from a camera or a CO2 sensor or a camera that is connected to an algorithm that's doing real-time albedo analysis. Yeah. Why? Oh, no. What have I done?
Missing the Y. I think it's DroneToast.py, right? It just got the. There you go.
Okay, so whatever. So that simulator is still running. I've started a simple Python script that is running one of the tools that we're working on in LANDRS. In theory, this could be run on the ground, but it also could be run on the drone, and that is certainly one of its use cases. And you have seen many of these kind of interfaces today. So this tool is demonstrating a couple of things. It's demonstrating the generation of APIs. So again, these could be machine readable or human readable. I showed you just now, go away, zoom, something like this. This is also a Sparkle interface, hypothetically, on the drone. Again, this is just a GUI for our purposes, but it would be a machine interface as well. So now you can write your algorithms to interface to that. And so the point is you can run real-time queries on graphs. Chuck alluded a little bit to this. You're not going to store images in the graph. For anybody who's not a drone pilot at the moment, a single flight, if you were flying a camera or LiDAR or radar, you can generate a terabyte of data. You're not going to put that into a graph. However, depending on what you're looking for, it could be very well worth your while to put annotations of those collections of data. So that stack of images annotated with your altitude, your location, perhaps you're fusing that information with a temperature sensor, a complicated thing, particularly when you come to comparing drone data from different flights or different drones, is verifying what altitude you're using, because you could be using your barometric altitude, you could be using your GPS generated altitude, you could be using altitude above ground, altitude above sea level. It can quickly become complex if you're wanting to use somebody else's data, or compare your data with somebody else's data. And so the point is, it would be useful to have that annotated and available for real-time queries. So if you were, I'll go back to my CO2 example. If I'm flying some sort of survey grid, say, over, I don't know, a rubbish dump, and I'm looking for a point source of methane, that's an easiest one and something that many people are doing. I might want my drone to change its flight plan mid-flight because it suddenly detects a spike in methane. Now, depending on your methane sensor, you quite possibly are going to be having to correct the readings that sensor is bringing in with the temperature calibration. So now I need to do some real-time analytics, and I might want to query my data for a particular temperature and a particular methane threshold. And if that some event or threshold is broken, change your flight plan. No longer carry on with your survey. Now do a vertical profile and then continue, or something similar like. And so the point of this is that this stack enables that very easily. So for here, I just have run a query on some data that came out of that CITL simulation, looking for points where you were flying over 120 meters. Nothing particularly interesting here, but same thing. Now it gives me IDs for that data source. So say this graph was annotating imagery. I would now have an ID that would dereference the images that correlate to that point in time or over that altitude threshold. Other parts of this API that it generates, so you could just ask, give me all the sensors on a given drone, and it would give you URIs for those sensors. You could ask for more information about the particular drone. Again, think about this in terms of publishing the data on the web, and now you need to know who captured that data, who funded the capture of that data. Was it a DJI Phantom? Was it a Pixel phone drone? Perhaps that matters. So all of this is effectively auto-generated by all the previous messy and difficult modeling and API development work. So hopefully that provides a little bit of context for why we need to do the messy work of incorporating semantic technologies. I mentioned in the beginning that I think there are many reasons for us to be addressing the drone data pipeline specifically. And one of those is that there is this window of opportunity that we don't yet have norms and standards. Never mind norms and standards, we don't even have good, robust tool sets for handling the data that is coming off these drones. They're coming and they're evolving, but there's a window of opportunity to capture this data in a format that allows us to easily make that data fair, compared to so much of our other data that we have in Earth science, where we are going back and saying, okay, we have these decades of soil moisture or satellite data or whatever, and we want to publish it, we want to make it easily accessible so that people can reuse it and extract maximum value from it, but we're having to retroactively process that data, and we can skip that going backwards step for drone data because there isn't a norm yet. We can do this correctly, and the semantic technology space has matured a lot in the last few years, and I would argue is ready to be used in this space. Yeah, so that was quite a long session with probably a lot of information. Maybe I want to talk about, you guys are all part of the ESIP community. You attended this drone cluster. How do I get, if I stop sharing, I can get back everybody else in this group. We started with just listing what people are using drones for. What are they capturing? What do they dream of capturing? It would be great for us as a community to have a conversation about where do you see this drone cluster serving you? What are your critical needs? What are you working on at the moment? Where do you see opportunities? Where do you see that you have a tool that you think everybody else in this group would benefit from? Yeah, I want to open it up for discussion, really. Chuck and
Okay.
and yes, go for it.
Hi, this is Dave Jones. Hello, I'm new to the cluster, but I'm the co-chair of the Disaster Lifecycle Cluster for ESIP. And the session technically was well above my head, but I do have some more basic questions, and I'm wondering if the drone cluster is interested in looking at this, or you might have some good pointers for us to take a look at. We have a data sharing and collaboration technology called GeoCollaborate, and we work with emergency managers, we work with the transportation sector, we work with a whole bunch of other groups, including the National Weather Service, NOAA. And we're looking at being able to take drone imagery almost live, if that's possible, that's geolocated, and get it in a geospatial format so we can share it across devices. So we have the capability and the technology now to connect any device in real time. We can move their maps on every device, display data on those devices. And I'm looking to see if you know, or the cluster knows how we can get access to, I don't know if it's drone to map technology or, you know, how we might be able to do it. Some of the stuff you're talking about sounds really interesting, but I'm not really sure how that applies in the applications world, because that's kind of where I live. Thanks.
Sure. Really good question. I bet a lot of people in this group could respond in terms of talking with you about image stitching and point cloud generation. I guess maybe you want to say a bit more about the technology stack you guys are already looking to use?
Absolutely. We've developed a technology called GeoCollaborate, so we can through a web interface, anybody can connect to that URL, turn GeoCollaborate on, and we can control everyone's maps on any device in real time. And so what I'm really looking to do is to access geospatial friendly, maybe it's tiled drone imagery, maybe even taking two different drones that are hovering near the same fire or event, and being able to stitch that drone imagery together so we can see more of a broader picture of the situation and certain things, certain use cases. So GeoCollaborate was actually developed under the federal government's SBIR program. And so we've now reached phase 3, which means we're sole source with every federal agency in the US government. So they can immediately come to us to put GeoCollaborate to work. And I'm just seeing how we can integrate drone imagery. And it's just not my expertise, but I have users saying, can you do drone data? And so I thought, well, I'm coming to the drone cluster to see if we can do something.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about that. So I'm co-PI on a project called njcoast.us. So this was funded from some post-Sandy disaster money that we built essentially almost the exact same platform that you have for the state of New Jersey. It's a situational awareness platform. You can do geospatial markup, share map information, but it wraps computational models for storm surge that use machine learning. And this was done in collaboration with civil engineers at the University of Notre Dame. There's a high fidelity finite element model called ADCIRC. They do machine learning essentially over that in ensembles and figure out, based upon the current trajectory, which we pull from NOAA, right, what the most probabilistic, sort of effect on a community along the New Jersey shore would be, right? And then there's essentially a web app that's built using OGC sort of stuff, so WFS. It's actually built in something called GeoNode as sort of an information management system, but the idea is that it uses OGC services, right? And so what we're trying to do on the drone side is that this whole web service thing that I sort of alluded to, right? is could be an OGC service stack. So it could be a OGC API tiling service. It could be other sorts of things that then serve out GeoJSON, right, or GeoJSON LD more preferentially, because then you at least have links back to what the actual feature is and what other information is, so you can figure out some more of the semantic aspects, right? And so, I mean, there's a couple of ways that you could approach this. I mean, we've approached this as sort of a Web of Things or Internet of Things sort of idea that has the drone itself has a simple API and interface, but it talks then to some sort of a publication appliance, which then runs OGC services, right? And then so data sets would be exposed, and streaming data would be exposed through those sort of standardized APIs. But then the JSON LD bit basically gives you the link back to more expressive things, right? And all those things, the thing behind the scenes that enables those APIs is actually this whole semantic sparkle thing. So from a web development perspective, and from a sort of drone development, or excuse me, a situational awareness app that you're talking about, it basically just looks like building out using Leaflet or open layers or something like that, and sets of layers, right? But the layers contain more rich information because they have semantic links to other things, right? So that's one way that you could think about doing this. I have a collaboration, like I said, with some folks at Notre Dame that the same NJ Coast that run for NERI, the post-disaster reconnaissance group for civil engineering. So we've had discussions about what this stack would actually start to look like for the NSF civil engineering post-disaster reconnaissance sort of efforts. So
that's great.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Charles. Just one quick question. Is when you're talking about, because we can already get imagery we can get video, so we can show video by saying, hey, an airplane, for example, in Alaska, they were observing the river ice breakup. We got that video, put it into GeoCollaborate. Everybody was able to see it. It wasn't live; it was just uploaded somewhere. But I'm thinking, like, the next step. Do you see it, whether it's possible? I think you can see it on TV in LA sometimes when they're doing the fires, where they're showing live video, but you can see the geospatial overlays of the roads in real time. So do you see that happening? Is that some of the work that you're doing?
I mean, you can already, do some of that information, but open layers basically would let you, there's something called Cesium.js, which is a 3D framework, which actually Cesium.js is the thing that there was this whole Yaz GUI thing that we sort of, hand-wavingly said that you can visualize mapped information and 3D information. And so the answer is yes. But the thing that I'm more concerned about and that we're trying to address is that, I mean, it's, what feature are you actually looking at? And is it the same thing that drone A is collecting that drone B is collecting, right? And are they in the same place? And these are maybe different manufacturers using a different technology stack. How do I do the alignment between those to make sure that these are the same sorts of things? What is the measurement units for so let's say that you have a nose sensor that is looking at air quality over and around the fire or something like that. How do I compare that with, say, measurements of video that are coming off that are showing you smoke density or something like that in the case of your fire incident, right? And so that's the type of questions that the underlying technology approach that we're trying to take here are trying to, address. And OGC is moving so that the sort of open spatial standards sort of direction, right? That's also the direction that they're moving, right? Is how can they start to add semantics into these web standards for displaying map information. So this is this WFS thing, Web Feature Service, that I was talking about. The new version is basically based off of web technologies and JSON and Open API, right? Which we're trying to incorporate. But we have to bridge those gaps. So a lot of the questions that we're trying to answer is, well, how do we start to bridge the gaps so that we have more information than just the raw data stream, where we can then start to do these sorts of comparisons that you're talking about? And that's what this is meant to address.
Oh, that sounds great. Thanks very much. I don't want to monopolize the time.
Yep. If you, I think my contact information is somewhere. I mean, if you have more questions, I'm more than willing to. I like to talk. So.
Yeah,
no,
Dave,
that's
hey,
Dave,
no
this is Peter.
Hey, Peter.
This is Peter here. Hey, so I'm both a drone operator and also have quite an extensive experience with Dave's GeoCollaborate from years back with volcanoes. And as an operator of an aircraft, especially going for beyond line of sight flying, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion on what we can actually stream back in real time. The FAA requires you to ensure continued navigational communication with your aircraft. You will have to switch off a data stream if it's stopping your aircraft from flying safely and effectively and efficiently in the airspace. So you're going to need an effective and efficient process to stream the critical data back to your ground station, wherever that might be, or receiving station of the data, and then get that onto some sort of web mapping service or online API that something like GeoCollaborate can connect to. And that's going to be a struggle when you're talking about full motion video footage that starts generating gigabytes, where you can GIS, geolocate where the aircraft is relative to the ground. You're going to be generating 12 megapixel images, 20 megapixel images, which are going to be giving you centimeter, decimeter resolution of the ground surface. How do you stream that back when you've got two communication networks you can use for navigation, 2.4 and 5.6 gigahertz? Your data stream cannot overwrite the flight. So if you're going to be pulling back data from real time from a beyond line of sight operation where the aircraft is 30 kilometers upriver, for example, with the river ice that you mentioned from what the River Ice Watch and River Watch groups does, how do you get that data back without impacting navigation of that aircraft? Because the FAA will not let you fly that aircraft if your operations is ensuring that your data communication is impacting your navigational communication.
Yeah, I was
that's
thinking
a critical
too.
component.
I'm sorry, Peter. I was going to say that's really very, very helpful, and I'm really thinking that perhaps it's initially, and I don't know if this is something the drone cluster wants to take up or whatever. It's something that I don't know where else to turn to for this kind of expertise and advice. Is perhaps the drone is just up collecting some images, and then the drone comes and lands, and then it uploads the imagery. It gets put into web map tiles, and that's when I can grab it right from those geospatial services. But anyway, it's something maybe we can continue via email or whatever. And I really appreciate being able to step back a couple of parsecs or whatever back into lower technology language. You guys have
just a
filled
quick
my
comment.
brain.
So we have considered that use case. One of the things we're looking at is 5G, so out of band, right? So we don't want to necessarily use a Mavlink stream and some of these other radio streams necessarily to send out of band high volume information. But there's other options, right? So these little 5G radios have gotten relatively cheap, other sorts of technologies, right? And so you can imagine, those sorts of things maybe being sent via some different technologies. And we're thinking about these sorts of things. We also support that use case. The first use case we're doing is exactly the one you say, that there's some flight, it collects some data, it comes back, uploads to some what we call a publication appliance, right? And then the second use case is how do you then start to do the real-time stream monitoring? We have a feeling for how to do that, but we probably don't have the time and the money to actually build that part out.
Yeah, we did some work actually in 2017 here in Alaska, flying a helicopter aircraft along Circle, which is a river ice breakup area. What we did is we were in the field. We don't have 5G. We don't have 4G in the community. We don't even have 3G. We don't even have LTE. So we had to send every 30th image to the National Weather Service for them to put into their version, or Arctic Gamma, which is another web-based tool. And then once we processed the mosaic, then we could put the mosaic onto the system. But we couldn't send every image. We had about 800. We couldn't send every individual image to the interface because even with a hotspot network locally at the download site for the aircraft, it was just going to take 48 hours just to get that data out of the local area. So by doing every 30th image at least then it wasn't a perfect overlap, but there was at least segments of the imagery along the river. We processed the mosaic and then pushed the mosaic as a GeoTIFF, which was still a large data file for some of these remote locations. It probably would be a small file for a big city conurbation or an urban location.
Sure.
But when we're talking about the area that Dave's supporting with the natural disasters and side of it, where your communication network may be limited, there's going to be lots of different use cases with those operators that have the connections to the FAA, because then they can say, we have safely flown, it's not impacted communications, it's not impacted flight operations. We can now successfully, routinely fly this in a safe, effective, and efficient manner. Yeah. Then they'll start to become information that others can then use. If someone else wanted to fly an aircraft beyond line of sight and wanted to get a certificate of authorization, they can follow that step. And the FAA have got sort of a confirmation that they're following the same protocols that a approved group had done. So there's that's another aspect. But yeah, I think understanding communication capabilities, limitations, both positive, like what's the full breadth you could send versus what's the minimum that you want to send to be effective. Having sort of protocols, having defined processes to make that happen will make it a much more effective and efficient way that this data can be ingested.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate
hold on,
that.
Dave, really quickly. Before you guys keep going, this is Annie. I just wanted to give a quick time check, and
yes.
As we have another session, just to let people have a break if they need it, since we have an evening plenary tonight. I'm not going to end this Zoom, so if you guys want to keep the conversation going, I just wanted to let everyone that needs an exhale before the session take that.
Yes.
I'm going to end the live stream, but please keep chatting if you would like to. I will not end the Zoom meeting. So,
well, actually, Jane and I have to leave because we're on the plenary.